Anyway, I'm Steve Gill. I taught IT and maths at Stafford and Featherstone prisons from 2002, and they let me out for good behaviour in 2014, so I retired then. Whilst I was at Stafford Jail, I did see the Tome, which is a massive book about this big, about this thick, white gloves, and you have to open it up, and the copper plate writing tells the history on 2 pages of every execution that's occurred, with the exception of the first 9. So that goes back to 1790, 1800. Whilst I was doing that and talking about Stafford Jail, the name Ruth Ellis kept coming up. And, well, I looked into it. I'm going to give my age away now. I was 4 years old when Ruth Ellis, the last woman in this country to be hung, was hanged in a Holloway jail. This is the story of her. A few months back, Nigel Havers stood as a judge on an ITV programme for 4 Fridays and told of the story of Ruth Ellis from the court perspective. And I hope this adds, if any of you saw that, it was good for what it said, but I think this has got a more generalised feeling to it. So anyway, this is the story of the daughter of Arthur Hornby, okay? The daughter of Arthur Hornby, and there he is, Arthur Hornby, was Ruth Ellis. She was the 5th child of the union between Elizabeth Bertha Gortels, who was a Belgian, First World War, we're talking, and she was a refugee into the country where she met somebody and had a child, and then she met Arthur Hornby, who was a cellist from Manchester. They eventually got married at Cheltenham-cum-Hardy in Manchester, and they moved to Rhyl. They lived in Rhyl for the first part of their lives. And there she is, the sad story of Ruth Ellis. If you look over it as a historian would, really, she was quite a brave person, because it was through her death that really we've got the abolition. I mean, it took 10 years more, don't get me wrong, but the abolition of capital punishment. Whether you agree or whether you disagree with that, we could carry on till next week. But anyway, that's what she really was there in the place to do. There's the building in Rhyl where she was born. It's 74 West Parade. I rang the Tourist Information Office about getting a blue plaque put on there, but the town council won't have it. So it's still there. It looks like that now. Her father was a cellist, as I say. He used to play in Manchester and Liverpool. And before the First World War, he used to ply on the boats across the Atlantic, playing his cello between New York and England and one thing and another. She died aged 28 on the 13th of July, 55. And I was 4 years old, 3 weeks from my 5th birthday, so you can work that one out. Cause of death, hanging, resting place, Holloway prison. Well, yes, she was there for many years, but they wanted to extend the prison in the 70s, and in extending the prison, they had to take away some of the bodies, so they were exhumed, and she's now buried in St Mary's Church, Old Amersham. It's a little village just outside Amersham in Buckinghamshire. She has her place there. More about that a little bit later. And as I say, she was the last woman in this country to be hung. I'm not going to go heavily through this, but what this does show is Elizabeth and Arthur Elizabeth, when she came over, she had a dalliance with somebody, and Julius Arthur was born. And when Elizabeth and Arthur got together, he was part of the family. But between them, they had 7 children along that line. The ones with the black lines around died in infancy. So the rate of infancy was a lot, infant death was a lot higher in those days. A bit more later, I'll go into some more of them there. But there we are. The lady that we will concentrate a bit later on is her eldest sister, but that's for later. That's Julius Arthur. Okay, that was him delivering flowers to Ruth Ellis before she was executed. Ruth Neilson, as she became, and the reason she became Ruth Nelson is after the 4th child was born, her father decided to change the surname to Neilson to try and promote himself a bit better within the music circles that he was trying to. Why he did it, we don't really know. So she was born Ruth Nelson. Her family moved south to Basingstoke in Hampshire, and then on to Hampstead in North London, where Arthur had greater chances of work. It was all to get work. That's all he was really interested in. Her early years in Basingstoke were at Fairfield's Senior Girls' School until 14 years of age, and she left to become a waitress she quite enjoyed the waitress work. And now we're talking towards the back end of the war, and she met a guy called Claire Andreas, who was a Canadian over here for what was going to be the Normandy landings later on. And they had a child together. His name was called Claire Andrea Nelson. And actually for a year, although he wasn't around, he did send money to Ruth for the support of the child. She did various factory clerical jobs at about £2 a week, but she did find that she could make more money doing elsewhere. And this is where we come back to the saucy bits that you were expecting from another talk. That's a picture of Ruth Ellis with her son. That's about age 9. He had a troubled life. When she went to the camera club, for 2 sessions of about 15-20 minutes, she could earn 30 to £40, £15 to £20 per session. And these were the sort of pictures that were taken of Ruth Ellis at the camera club. And this is what put her down a very, very slippery slope. She was quite well known, and she became a hostess, and I put that in inverted commas, at another club run by a guy called Maurice Connolly. He was the low-life vice king of London in the 50s. Don't hear much about him. Had a massive house in Surrey that paid for all this, and he earned money of immoral earnings from all the women that worked for him in London. There she met a guy called George Ellis. He was a dentist, and he and his wife had split up, and she knew him. And she became manager of the little club in Mayfair. And that was like a rise. She had a flat with it where she could bring up Andy, and that's how life moved on. That's Mo Connolly. That's him at his retreat in Surrey. Of course, you don't see him because he's got his dark glasses on. He keeps well behind the scenes. And there she is at the Court Club. So she was doing reasonably well at that time. Life with George Ellis was good income, high expenditure. On the 8th of November 50, Ruth married George Johnson Ellis, 41. He'd been married before, and she had a film part in 1951 as an unnamed extra in the film. So There's George Ellis. He wouldn't accept the fact that the child that she had was his. So the marriage deteriorated rapidly. She's second on the left, an unnamed extra in the film, Lady Godiva Rides Again, 1951. Okay, to be seen on Talking Pictures if you're, no, I'm only joking, okay. And in 1951, Ruth gave birth to this daughter and he called her George, and she called it Georgina. But by this time, George had really abandoned her. So they later separated and divorced. That's the daughter later on, Georgina, and she died rather young, but anyway, later, more about that later. It was while she was manager of the Little Club that she met a guy called David Blakely. There were a group of racing drivers, Mike Hawthorne, the early days of Stirling Moss and Brabham and all those names from that period of time. And they had like a little club together where they'd go and have a drink, and this was the Little Club in Mayfair. Through that, she met a racing driver through Mike Hawthorne, and his name was David Blakely. He had a car. That's the car. It's now in a museum on the Isle of Man, I think it is. Isle of Wight, sorry, on the Isle of Wight. It's in a museum over there. He inherited £7,000 from the death of his father, and he spent that £7,000 all on the car. He had no other means of making money, and he sponged off of the hostess, who was Ruth Ellis. There they are, good-looking times, and, you know, everything looks lovely, but it wasn't behind the scenes. Ruth began seeing another guy called Desmond Cousin. He was a RAF pilot from the bombers, the Lancaster bombers during World War II. He was also a director of Cousin and Co., who were wholesale and retail tobacconists around the London area. So he was well made financially. But Ruth was sacked as manager of the Little Club for all the goings on that were going on. And I mean, it must have been pretty bad. But she moved in with Cousin at his house in Devonshire Street, which runs parallel to Oxford Street, just north of Oxford Street in London. So a good area of London, rich and that. And she did that basically for stability. And she moved in there with the children as well. But there were strange goings-ons. Okay, that's her with Desmond Cousin. Okay, a very dubious guy. There's an interview of him, and after it all happened, they put pertinent questions to him, and he was ducking and diving and avoiding them like anything. He didn't want to implicate himself. Cousins loathed her relationship with Blakely, one of alcohol and drugs and passionate sex and extreme violence. Ruth and Blakely continued to see other people. Blakely offered to marry Ellis, to which she consented. But she lost another child in January 55 after a miscarriage induced by a punch to the stomach in an argument with Blakely. He was a very violent man. Whether she said this with intent initially, we don't know. But she said to Cousin, "Oh, I want to kill him." Whether she said it sort of an off-the-cuff remark of what had happened to her, or whether she sent it with intent, well, all I can say is it did manifest itself because she was trained for murder. On Easter Sunday in April, 70 years ago, Cousins loaded the gun for Ruth to commit murder. He'd already taken her to a place called Burnham Beeches in Buckinghamshire, where there was a rifle and a pistol range. And he taught her how to fire a Smith & Wesson 38. That is the actual gun. It's in the museum, the Met Museum in London. it's got a hell of a recoil on it. So if you fire it, it fires back. And she was only 5'2", 100 odd pounds, not much. So a recoil on something like for a frail woman, it wasn't easy for her to fire that gun. But there were thousands of these guns in existence because a lot of them had come over with the troops from the war. And Smith & Wesson is an American brand. The murder of David Blakely has got two stories. The official one, which was given to the judge and the court, and the unofficial one, which is probably true. And when I listened to Nigel Havers telling the story, you only heard what went through the courts. But on Easter Sunday, the 10th of April, Ellis took a taxi from Cousins' home to a flat in Tanser Road, Hampstead. And this was the home of Anthony and Carol Finlater. Now, they were friends of Blakely. Carol Finlater was more than just a friend to David Blakely. I'll leave that up to your own imagination. Where she suspected Blakely might be. And as they arrived, Blakely's car drove off. So she walked the quarter of a mile to the Magdala pub, a public house in Hampstead, where she found Blakely's car parked outside. Now, that was given to the court. On the left there, you can see the home of Cousins in Devonshire Road and Devonshire Street, rather. And on the right, you can see the flat in Hampstead where the Finlaters, not a very good photo, I must admit, where they resided. The unofficial version was that, yes, on Easter Sunday, Cousins drove Ellis to the home of the Finlaters in Tanser Road, Hampstead, where she suspected they might be. But as they arrived, Blakely's car drove off, so they followed it the quarter of a mile to the Magdala. She knew nothing about walking or anything like that, and they got to the Magdala, to the club. But she put it like that. She wanted it put like that at the trial, not to implicate Cousins for driving her there. This is a picture from the 50s of and you can see the old cars. That is the Magdala pub. It's still there today. It does close now and again for refurbs and having tough times. It's open at the moment, and you can go there and you can have food there and drink there. It was a Charrington's pub. When she got to the point, I don't know if this is working. Oh, it is, good. When she arrived, she stood about here. So she could look through that window and she could see David Blakely with his friend, Clive Glunnell. They were having a drink together. And then as they got up to leave after having their drink and put their coats on and moved towards the door, she moved down from her place there to stand about here by the door. And as David came out, she said, "David," and he ignored her. And, oh, I've gone past, there we go. "David," and he ignored her, and he got his keys out of his car and started to run. By this time, she'd got the gun out of her handbag. She fired one shot, which missed, but the second, third, fourth, and fifth all hit him. And after the pathology report later, he was probably dead before he hit the floor from the second shot that came out of the gun. Hit him in the spine, and that was it. The sixth shot, the last one, missed and ricocheted off the wall and injured a lady who was going into the pub called Gladys Ewell. Caught at the base of her thumb as she walked into the Magdala Club. How do we know that? Because the next day when she went to the magistrate court, they took photographs of her with her hand all bound up from the happening. There was a plate, this is much later, in about 1960 something, of a plate put on the wall showing the chips made by the bullet that missed. But there's two things that are wrong on there. The bullets wouldn't have made those type of marks, so they think that's falsely put there. And if you look at the date, it says 1954, so it was removed because it was a year early. That says it was a year early. It happened in 55. So that's not there now. After the murder, Ruth asked Clive Gunnell to call the police. But inside the pub was an off-duty policeman, Alan Thompson, who arrested Ruth. They went to Hampstead Police Station. There was a confession from her, and she was charged with murder. She knew what she'd done. She was quite au fait with what she'd done, and she accepted it. Blakely's dead body was taken to hospital and later buried in the Holy Trinity Church, still there at Penn in Buckinghamshire. This led to an investigation and leading later to a trial. The police interrogated Ruth Ellis and took a statement from her, as I said, at Hampstead Police Station. She made her first appearance at the Magistrates' Court on the 11th of April and was ordered to be held on remand. She was twice examined by medical officers, Henry Williams, and she went through one of those examinations, a word I'm not going to attempt, but it basically is a brain scan, right? And they found neither of them any abnormalities in her functions as far as what her thoughts were. While on remand in Holloway, she was examined by the psychiatrist, Whitaker for the defence and Dazelle for the prosecution, Home Office. Neither found any form of insanity. There was no evidence. What they did find through her bank account is that she was financially broke. When I say that, she had 5 old pennies in her purse to her name. She couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Blakely had milked every penny he could out of her. I talked about Nigel Havers. Nigel Havers had quite a part in this story. On Parkinson in 2010, he told Parky about his grandfather, because his grandfather was Cecil Havers, the judge that sent Ruth Ellis to her death. His father, right, Cecil's son, was Michael Havers, who sent Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, to his incarceration. So there is quite a big legal fraternity at the top of the end of the scale within the Havers family. His aunt, Elizabeth Havers, became Elizabeth Butler Slosh, and she was the first lady at the Court of Appeal. So, as he turned around and said it, I was the real low of the low within the family. I was a mere actor, he says. That's the way he put it. On the right in that picture is a guy called Christmas Humphreys. He's quite an character in himself. He was the head Buddhist within the UK at the time. She had been told by her solicitor that she would be asked certain questions. Although he couldn't tell her what to reply, he inferred to her that if she should really think about it, because it could mean her life or not. And but she tended not to take any notice of it. She knew what she'd done. Prosecution Christmas Humphreys asked the question, when you fired the revolver at close range into the body of David Blakely, what did you intend to do? And she replied after a silence, it's obvious when I shot him, I intended to kill him. And that really turned the whole thing. There was no way that Cecil Havers, the justice, could announce anything else and the jury could only say guilty. And because at the time the verdict of mandatory death sentence was to be carried out. When I say would have been carried out, it could have been exonerated. But a little bit more about that in a second. So there we go. The bit of dressing up, only a little bit. I'm not going deep into it. Anyway, Cecil Havers in his wig would then put the black cap on, and the black cap was literally just a square, and they put that on his head like that, and he would say, and this was created by the legal profession and put to Parliament so that it could be passed, so that if anybody was to hang, there would be a standard phraseology. Ruth Ellis, you will be taken from this place to a lawful prison and hence to a place of execution, where you will suffer death by hanging and your body buried in the precincts of the prison in which you shall be last confined before execution. May the Lord have mercy upon your soul.